What's up, clubs? Hey, hope everyone had a nice weekend. So, today, we're going to continue our discussion basically about the backswing. So, a couple weeks ago, we talked about the takeaway, right? It should be natural, no rolling, no forcing, no leaning, no turning. You know, you kind of have your V, right? You got your setup going, and then you don't really move much. You know, everything kind of stays, and if it kind of depends on what you want to feel, whether or not it's your shoulders pushing it back. I like to feel here that, you know, if my grip is this way, I kind of like to feel like my forearms and this wrist almost pushes it up and back. So I get that look of outside the hands, right? So anyway, what we're going to talk about today is once we get to here, what happens after that. So this really sets you up for this, and then transition and impact. So we get our setup going, right? I might be a little bit lower on the ball. That's just kind of the way I feel like, but you know, it varies on certain people. So once we get to here, then what happens? Well, you don't want to just keep cranking it back. You know, at some point, you know, your body kind of hits a wall and then the club should shoot up. So this is something where it's kind of going to be a little trial and error on what feelings that you want, whether or not it's in the arms, the shoulders, the legs. It all depends upon kind of how you are and learning your own swing, which is really important. But for me, for example, I'm just more upper body oriented, right? So I used to over crank my hips, over crank my pelvis. I didn't try to do that, it's just what I was doing. So I've had to work more or less to feel like I'm more restricting. But before, when I was trying to turn it back, I would, you know, turn. And that's where a lot of, I think, current coaching is, where it's like, oh, it's a lot of hip turn, and there's not a good medium in between. There's not a good description of the correct position on how your pelvis should look. Because in the pros, if you at first glance you're like, oh, they're just restricting, it's like, well, a really good example is Dustin Johnson. I think everybody would say he's got one of the most, if not the most athletic and probably non-repeatable moves on the planet. So pretty much no one will be able to do what Dustin Johnson can do. Similar to basically no one really can do what Rory can do. So those are, you know, pretty severe examples. If you were going to go off one swing or another, Dustin Johnson would probably be a more ideal position, and a lot of, you know, swing building trends is more Dustin Johnson than it is Rory, but that's another discussion. So anyway, what we want to talk about is, okay, we get to here, what happens now? Well, pretty much here, right, you've pretty much made a pretty good turn as far as, you know, moving away from the body, getting your shoulders in a good position. So the whole point of the takeaway is that once it gets here, things should start to flow pretty naturally. Now, some people have basically the gift of already being flexed, you know, with this wrist. But if you're not already doing it, trying to do this is a extremely difficult move, and you don't necessarily need a flexed wrist. But I will say, it is a very, very hard move to maintain. It is harsh on your wrists, and if it's not something already natural to you, just keep in mind that if you're working towards that, it's really hard to maintain. So back to here. So okay, we're here. What's next? Well, the way that I like to feel is I get my setup, and I don't restrict per se, but I like to feel like this leg is dug in. Now, I've always naturally been, you know, fairly easy to right side load. some coaches or some instruction out there might say, okay, well, here's how you should look, right? Turn like this. I think this is a dreadful position. The reason why it's a dreadful position is, sure, you've turned back, but you are pretty much stuck behind, and the only thing you can do is this. That's it. Or you can turn, come over the top. So I think probably the most common or easiest way to dictate how the upper body works is to kind of focus on the lower body a little bit. So you have your leg position, you have your setup, and you don't want to restrict anything, but because you're not intentionally turning your hips back, the resistance that you're going to start to run into here basically pops the club up. So from here, you don't need to do a whole lot, right? So if you have your grip like from this position, almost, you reach probably here too, unless you're really, really flexible, you're starting to reach a point of maximization as far as flexibility without then starting to, over crank. So loose here, and then we're not stopping our, load, but it's starting to come to a point where you're starting to get to a point where you're going to get maxed out. And as here, the club should naturally pop up, right? So if you look at, I sway a little bit. My head probably moves a little bit off the ball. I try to stay more centered. It's not a necessity. I think ideally, if okay, we'll take Rory, for example. Rory makes a move off the ball, right? And no one is going to say that Rory has a bad move. If you look at a lot of long drivers, they're like, they make a huge move off the ball. That's for driving. With irons, you could probably start running into it, an issue, I should say. But if you don't need to feel like you have to stay here. Your head's got to stay in the same spot, right? The reason why you don't need to feel like your head needs to stay in the same spot is what can happen is if you're resisting, you're going to think like, oh, I got to keep my head in the same spot. What's going to happen is you're not going to naturally flow, and it's going to cause you to lean in towards the ball and left side load early, and then you come out of it early. That's sort of digressing away from what we're talking about, but at the same time, it's all interconnected. So we talked about working the swing backwards. What helped me before is, okay, I want to get into this position, right? Well, how would I get there? And then from here, I work backwards. But anyway, we're doing the takeaway and we're doing, post takeaway. So if you want to focus on the legs where, let's just take, where my head is. And again, remember setup, ball position, left neckline, left ear, right around here. You don't need to dictate or change this for shorter or longer clubs, okay? If you want to change something, you keep the ball position constant and maybe you widen your stance. But this will help you be more consistent in setup, because the more consistent in setup, the more consistent your ball striking is going to be. So anyway, back to this. So if we're here, right, we're doing the takeaway, looking at my target, remember, slightly left of where you might think, right? So I'm going to go back. I got the takeaway, right? So I'm in my right side, and I know I'm in my right side because I'm feeling it in the crease in my right pelvis and right hip, and I feel the weight in my right heel. That's where you should feel it, right? In your right heel. You don't want to be in your toe. Now, again, because I used to over crank, I keep my knee more flexed. Some people might automatically keep it more flexed, and they would need to work on straightening the leg a little bit. That is dependent completely on how you're currently set up, so I'm not gonna address that. Just keep in mind that if you were straightening your leg out too much, you might want to try keeping it a little flexed or feeling like it's a little flexed, and vice versa. So anyway, takeaway, right side loaded, and then from here, the club shoots up. So I got my takeaway. This basically, the takeaway sets how your swing is going to go. Takeaway, loose, 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 more tension, clubs up, right side loaded. I'm turned, not excessive, right? The club is nice and up, and it's gonna prepare us for transition and impact. So down the line, right? Looking at my target. Okay, loose, 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 turn back up. Okay, basically my body turn is effectively coming to a stop here, and because that's happening, it shoots the club up. Pro tip, not enough people emphasize how the head turn can dictate how the swing goes. So if you are right eye dominant, you might want to consider a little counter resistance, meaning your head moves a little this way, right? And in the downswing, you might want to consider counter resistance, moving it that way. A really, good example of this is both Brooks Koepka and Hideki. If you look at them through impact, when they are through impact, they're not like this, they're like this. And what does that do? That can help you always get into a more consistent ball position coming from the inside. Even if you're not hitting a draw, you obviously, the ideal position is neutral, a little bit inside, etc. That'll just give you more consistent ball striking and coming in at a really good angle of attack. So if you're left eye dominant, you might, if it might be a Dustin situation where, his head kind of moves forward, etc. It's really experimentation too, what kind of works. So how do you tell if you're left eye or right eye dominant? You can't really try it intentionally. It's like when you look at something, do you squint with your left or do you squint with your right? Like when you're looking at something, ooh, look at this super dumpy range ball. Which one are you looking at it with first? So that's a little pro tip. Just be careful in that sense where you don't want to overdo it. One, obviously injury. And two, again, if you overdo it, it can cause you to stack and tilt, right? So, conclusion. We got our setup. Left neckline. Okay? Target. Slightly left of where you might originally think until you get the habit of knowing that. Okay, ready? Hands don't move the takeaway, right? And you can kind of also tell this too, where the left arm is still lower than the right and the left shoulder is lower than the right. I got a nice steep shoulder plane, right? In. Okay, I'm about to max out here. I'm right side loaded. Now arms naturally shoot up. And then next week or the following week, we're going to talk about transition. All right, thanks. See you next week.